On May 13th, 2026, Costco Wholesale Corporation filed a Form 8K with the Securities and Exchange Commission announcing the permanent closure of all 138 of its Costco warehouse locations within the state of California, effective in phased wind-downs through the end of the fourth quarter. 49 years of continuous California presence in the very state where the first Costco warehouse ever opened, gone. Approximately 51,000 California warehouse employees, forklift operators, and membership staff receiving termination notices. And the state of California just lost one of its largest private employers and the membership warehouse where roughly 9 million California households bought their groceries, their gasoline, and their medications, along with an estimated $34 billion in annual sales activity that will never be recovered in the form it took. Now, I have watched a lot of retailers move in my 95 years on this earth. I have watched chains open in places nobody believed could support them and close in places everyone assumed were permanent. I have watched the most stable consumer brands on this continent quietly reassess where they wanted to be 5 years from now and act on the answer. But what just happened between Costco and the state of California is something I want to walk you through carefully, because this is not a story about a warehouse club closing 138 doors. This is a story about a state that watched its retail economics deteriorate for a decade, listened to its own governor describe the deterioration on a public stage, and is now staring at 138 enormous empty buildings from Eureka to El Centro, wondering what comes next, and wondering how 9 million households are going to absorb the difference between Costco prices and everything else. And the people paying for those empty warehouses are not executives in Issaquah. They are the 51,000 workers who showed up to those warehouses every morning, and the working families across California who never had the option to shop somewhere cheaper. I have been sitting in the same office in Omaha, Nebraska for over 50 years. Same desk, same chair, same view of a parking lot that has not changed in any meaningful way since the Ford administration. I drink about 5 cherry Cokes a day, and I will tell you, I have always admired Costco because it is one of the few businesses I have ever studied that genuinely treats its customers and its employees the way I would want to be treated myself. I still live in the house I bought in 1958 for $31,500. And every single morning I show up to that office because there is nothing on this earth I would rather be doing. People ask me all the time why I never moved Berkshire Hathaway to a coast, why I never chased California weather or New York energy, and I always give them the same answer. Because the business I was building did not care what zip code I was sitting in. The numbers worked in Omaha, so I stayed in Omaha. Costco operated warehouses in California for 49 years for exactly the same reason. The numbers worked, and then they stopped working. And the moment they stopped, the company did what any rational corporation does when the arithmetic changes. It followed the math. Now, let me tell you how a single warehouse in San Diego in 1976 became one of the most respected and most disciplined retail operations in the history of commerce. Costco did not become Costco by selling at high margins. It became Costco by doing the opposite, by deliberately keeping its markup on merchandise capped at a famously thin level, by making the bulk of its profit on the annual membership fee rather than on the goods themselves, and by passing nearly every dollar of efficiency it captured back to the member in the form of lower prices. The very first warehouse under the Price Club banner, the company that would later merge into Costco, opened in San Diego in 1976. By 2026, the company operated 138 warehouses across California, more than in any other state, employed approximately 51,000 Californians, served roughly 9 million California member households, and generated, by the most credible industry estimates, somewhere in the neighborhood of $34 billion in annual California sales. Costco was not just a tenant in California, it was a load-bearing pillar of how the state's working and middle-class families managed the cost of feeding and supplying their households. And California had 49 years to understand exactly what that footprint represented. Now, I want you to pay close attention to what happened next, because this is where my partner Charlie Munger's most important lesson becomes impossible to ignore. Charlie loved Costco, by the way. He was on its board for decades, and he used to say it was one of his favorite companies in the entire world. Charlie used to say, "Show me the incentive, and I will show you the outcome." Always the incentives, not the intentions, not the press releases, not the speeches at retail conferences, the incentives. So let us look honestly at the incentive structure California built for a high-volume, famously thin-margin warehouse retailer operating dozens of locations inside its borders over the last decade. And let me be clear at the outset, the people who built this structure were not bad people. They were responding to genuine concerns about wage stagnation in retail work, genuine concerns about the cost of living for hourly employees, genuine concerns about retail theft and worker safety, and genuine concerns about packaging and environmental waste. I understand every one of those impulses. The concerns were real. But over a period stretching from roughly 2017 through 2026, California assembled a stack of conditions that, taken individually, each had a defensible rationale, and taken together produced a mathematical conclusion the legislature never quite stopped to calculate. There was the steady rise in the state minimum wage to $16 per hour by 2024, with local ordinances pushing it higher in many of the cities where Costco operates. There was Senate Bill 54, the producer responsibility law for packaging, with compliance costs phasing in through 2026. There was the rise in industrial and commercial electricity rates, which by 2026 were running among the highest in the continental United States. There was the expanded paid leave and predictability scheduling framework. And then, in the early spring of 2026, came the fatal detail. The California legislature advanced a retail floor space and inventory tax measure aimed at large format retailers, assessing an annual levy calculated on the square footage and on-hand inventory value of warehouses exceeding 100,000 square feet, with a target implementation of January 1st, 2027. For a warehouse club model, which by its very design carries enormous square footage and enormous on-hand bulk inventory at thin markup, the tax fell with devastating precision. Costco's internal analysis, later referenced in shareholder communications, estimated that the measure would impose an annual cost averaging approximately $2.1 million per California warehouse, a figure that, against Costco's deliberately razor-thin merchandise margin, pushed a substantial majority of its 138 California locations into negative net contribution beginning with the 2027 fiscal year. Now, I want you to read that number the way the Costco board read it in the spring of 2026. If you are sitting in Issaquah with a team of advisors, and Costco has one of the most disciplined operations teams in all of retail, you are looking at a tax assessed on square footage and bulk inventory in a business model that is built specifically around large square footage and bulk inventory sold at almost no markup. This is not a tax on profit. It is a tax on the very physical structure of how the company creates value for its members. When the annual levy on the size and stock of a warehouse approaches or exceeds the thin profit that warehouse generates on merchandise, the location does not have a margin problem. It has an existence problem. The math is not close. It is not even an interesting question. The window to act is not after the 2027 fiscal year begins. The window is now, while the wind down can be staged in an orderly fashion, and the real estate, much of it company-owned and highly valuable, can be redeployed or sold on favorable terms. Clear incentives produce predictable behavior every single time. What followed was not a single corporate decision made in isolation. It was a bank run. I want you to hold that image because it is exactly right. When depositors believe a bank is about to fail, they do not wait politely for official confirmation. The ones who move first lose nothing. The ones who wait lose everything. So everyone moves first. That is the structure of what has been happening to California's large format retail for the better part of a decade. The largest consumer-facing employers in the state have been making the same simultaneous rational calculation Costco just finalized, and they have been quietly closing locations, withdrawing forward commitments, and reallocating capital before the next regulatory window closes. And the Costco announcement, when it came on May 13th, did not arrive alone. Walmart closed multiple California locations through 2024 and 2025. Target announced reductions to its California footprint and shortened hours at numerous urban locations, citing theft and operating conditions. Walgreens closed 5 San Francisco stores in 2021 and dozens more across California through 2025. CVS announced a multi-year California store reduction. Rite Aid contracted its California footprint dramatically through bankruptcy. In-N-Out closed its Oakland location in 2024, the first closure in the chain's history. Nordstrom closed its downtown San Francisco flagship. Whole Foods closed its flagship San Francisco location in 2023 after barely a year of operation. And now, the largest membership warehouse operator in the state, after 49 years of continuous California presence in the very state where the model was born, has filed its 8K to close every California warehouse. And in my experience, the names you can confirm publicly in any retail contraction are rarely the complete list. The estimated aggregate loss to California's retail tax base from confirmed major chain closures and contractions since 2020 exceeds $4.7 billion in annual state and local revenue, and that figure does not yet incorporate the Costco closure. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 51,000 jobs and $34 billion in annual sales in a single filing. That single sales figure exceeds the entire annual gross domestic product of several smaller American states. Now, I am going to tell you about the moment in this story that I find the most extraordinary, the moment that, to my mind, defines this entire situation better than any 8K filing or closure announcement possibly could. April 8th, 2026, the California Chamber of Commerce is hosting its annual host breakfast in Sacramento. Governor Gavin Newsom takes the stage for a moderated conversation on the state's economic outlook. It is 35 days before Costco's 8K is officially filed with the SEC, 35 days. And standing in front of an audience of business leaders, association representatives, and journalists in a venue specifically designed to host honest conversations about the state's competitive position, the governor of California says, in his own words from the published transcript, that California must, and I am quoting, be careful that the way we structure levies on our largest employers does not fall hardest on the high-volume, low-margin businesses that working families rely on to stretch a paycheck, and that the state, again, quoting directly, cannot keep adding costs to the very stores that keep prices down for the people we are trying to help. The sitting governor of California on a public stage in Sacramento 35 days before the largest single warehouse retail closure in the state's recent history was officially filed, describing with complete accuracy the precise mechanism of deterioration that was already executing while he stood there and spoke. I have been in business a long time. I have sat across the table from a lot of extraordinarily capable people, and I will tell you honestly, I cannot think of a parallel. A chief executive publicly and accurately describing the failure conditions of his own state's tax structure while the failure was already in motion, while the legislature he works with was simultaneously advancing the very measure that made it inevitable. That is not contradiction. That is a governing situation so thoroughly documented in real time that it almost defies analysis. Now step away from the executives in Issaquah entirely for a moment. My father, Howard Buffett, was a congressman from Nebraska and a deeply principled man who taught me that the measure of any economic policy is never what it promises on the day it is announced. It is what it delivers to ordinary people living inside it 10 years later. So let me tell you about Reuben Salcido. Reuben is 52 years old and has worked at the Costco warehouse in Fresno for 21 years, the last 9 of them as a warehouse operations supervisor managing the receiving dock and the forklift crew. He makes $31.40 an hour, which is well above what most retail in the Central Valley pays, has full medical and dental benefits, and has built a meaningful balance in Costco's 401k and stock programs over 2 decades. He lives with his wife and his youngest son in a 3-bedroom house in Clovis that they bought in 2011 for $189,000 and were on schedule to have paid off in 2031. His wife works part-time at a pharmacy. The closure announcement gives Reuben and his coworkers 90 days of notice and a severance package that his warehouse manager estimated would cover, on average, between 4 and 7 months of household expenses for the affected workers. But Reuben's problem is not only that he is losing the best-paying job he has ever had. It is that Costco was also where he and his neighbors bought the groceries that made the difference between making it to the end of the month and not. The $34 billion in annual sales that Costco generated in California was not an abstraction to Reuben. It was both his livelihood and his family's grocery budget. He did nothing to cause this. He had no seat at the table when the floor space and inventory tax was drafted. And the gap that the closure of 138 warehouses leaves does not quietly disappear when the doors are chained shut for the last time. It falls straight down onto the people who stayed, especially the working families for whom Costco prices were the thin margin between getting by and falling behind. In my experience, damage of this kind moves in distinct layers. One chain announces it is closing. The corporate parent surrenders 138 enormous buildings, much of the land company owned, and redeploys that capital to states where the arithmetic still works. The cities and counties that hosted those warehouses lose, by reasonable projection, approximately $480 million in combined annual direct sales tax revenue, plus an estimated additional $290 million in indirect business activity from the California farmers, the dairy operations, the trucking contractors, the gasoline suppliers, and the local food producers that sold into the Costco supply chain, a supply chain that for many California agricultural producers represented one of their single largest customers. The Costco gas stations, which were among the cheapest fuel in the state, vanish, removing downward pressure on local gasoline prices. The small businesses that had clustered near Costco locations to capture the foot traffic lose their anchor. The local school districts, funded in part through the affected property and sales tax flows, begin quietly modeling budget reductions. That is 3 full levels of damage from a single retail closure. Multiply that structure across 138 warehouses in dozens of California communities, and you begin to understand the actual magnitude of what has happened to the state's working families. And California is not running this experiment alone. That is the part I need you to hear clearly. New York City raised costs on its large format retailers and watched several anchor stores reduce or eliminate their urban presence. Oregon's gross receipts-based corporate activity tax has placed structural pressure on the thin margin grocers and warehouse operators its rural communities depend on most. Washington's business and occupation tax, also levied on gross receipts rather than net profit, has long disadvantaged high-volume, low-margin retail. Minnesota expanded its tax burden on large retailers in 2024, and by the second quarter of 2026, was reporting accelerating closures of full-service grocery in its outer counties. The same template, the same incentive structure, the same mathematically predictable outcome running on a slightly delayed timeline in each state. This is not 4 separate state-level stories. This is one national story about what happens when the incentive to close a thin-margin store becomes structurally more powerful than the incentive to keep it open. And right now, that story is accelerating in ways the daily news cycle is not fully tracking. I have made a lot of investments over the course of 70 years of reading financial statements, and the single most important lesson I have learned across all of it is this: you cannot earn your way out of a structural mistake by hoping that the people most affected by it will not notice what you have done. They notice, they always notice. And the people who notice the hardest are not the executives in Issaquah who simply move their capital to a state where the arithmetic works. The people who notice the hardest are the working families in Fresno and Bakersfield and Riverside, for whom Costco prices were the difference between getting by and falling behind. The people with the most options move first, and the people with the fewest options are left holding the consequences. That is the cruelest arithmetic of all. California is now attempting to figure out how to replace one of its largest private employers and the membership warehouse that 9 million households relied on to stretch a paycheck. The company, whose model was born in San Diego in 1976, is redeploying its capital to states where a tax on square footage does not exceed the profit on a pallet of goods. Reuben Salcido is updating his resume for the first time in 21 years and recalculating his family's grocery budget at the same time. The cities of the Central Valley are modeling their 2027 budgets around a retail anchor that no longer exists. And the governor who described the precise mechanism of this departure on a stage in Sacramento 35 days before the 8K was filed is preparing his next budget address. I stayed in Omaha my entire life because Omaha never gave me a reason to leave. That is the only reason any person or any business stays anywhere. Not loyalty, not habit, not sentiment, and not the fact that the company was born in your state 49 years ago. The math, change the math, and you change the behavior every single time, without a single exception in the history of commerce. The money never sits still when you announce publicly where you intend to send it, and capital never stays in a place where a tax on the size of your building exceeds the profit earned inside it. If you are watching this from a state where these conversations are just beginning, where the legislature is debating its own floor space levy or its own gross receipts tax or its own large format retail surcharge, you are not watching California's problem from a safe distance. You are watching your own situation playing out one election cycle ahead of you. If you have seen a warehouse or a grocer close quietly in your community, neighbors start driving farther for affordable food, or job postings simply stop appearing the way they once did, leave a comment below. Tell us what state you are in, what city you live in, what you are actually seeing on the ground. Subscribe to this channel because this story is nowhere near finished. The numbers are still moving, and wherever the numbers go, the story follows. They always do.